It's good to see you here this morning. Good to have another chance to speak to you. This morning we're going to be speaking about a very important topic, and it's something that we're going to be talking about for the next few weeks, actually. And it is the topic of elders. Now, why are we doing that? Well, because this year we are hoping to start a process that will result in us having more or new elders, more elders than we have right now. Now, that doesn't mean that next week we're going to be appointing elders, but means that this week we are starting a process. And that process may take a little while, but it's time for us to start that. And let me say, as we start this subject, that the subject of elders is among the most precious topics to God that there is. Now, why is that? Well, because elders are people that take care of God's children. I don't know how concerned you are with those that take care of your children, but certainly there's enough relation there that we can understand that this is something very important to God. And that's why we're taking a look at it this week and over the next couple weeks. And as we do this morning, we're going to take a look at and ask the question, why do we need elders? What is the need that the church has for elders? When we ask this question, there's a very simple answer of why do we need elders that is not really going to get at the point. But some people would just say, well, the Bible says that we should do that. God tells us to have elders. He gives us example after example. And every New Testament church that we see has elders put in place. So if the Bible says to do it, then we should have elders. Well, sure we should do that, but there's more to it than that. God makes plans as we make plans, except God's plans are perfect. If God's plans are perfect, that means His plan for the church is perfect. And part of God's plan for the church is the plan for the structure of that church. And of course, at the top of that structure is Christ, and then below that serve the elders over each local congregation. So why have elders? Well, because God designed the church to have elders. And He designed that in a perfect way so that it would be an independent group, but would have an authority that is self-governing, something that promotes unity as well. And we'll talk about some of these things as we move forward. But why do we need elders? Because God says so, and because God put a perfect plan in place for His church. But another part of this that is astounding, if you've never stopped to think about it, God chose man to lead His church. It's the most backwards thing I can think of, but God chose to do it. In the same way that God chose to use the foolishness of the message that would be preached by men to spread the gospel, God chose to have men lead the church on earth. God, in His perfect wisdom, somehow believed that it was best that humans would be the ones overseeing each church. Now, I think that has worked out great throughout the millennia. But it's incredible that God entrusted His church to mankind. It's a great responsibility, but that also means that being an elder is among the highest callings of anyone that is a Christian. So God's plan for the church has elders. Now, as a side note to this, no congregation should be satisfied until they have elders. No church should get complacent and say, well, okay, we don't have elders, that's okay. Because each church needs elders. Why? Because it's part of God's plan for the church. It would be like having a company but not having a CEO for the company. Or maybe a board of directors would be more accurate in this case. But if you don't have that, you don't have direction, you don't have leadership. So it needs to be in place. But there's too many congregations. And I understand that it's a problem, and I understand all the challenges, but there are too many congregations that end up going decades without having an eldership in place. And usually those congregations struggle as a result. So when it's possible, elderships should be put in place. Now, that being said, if it's important for every church to have an eldership, it's important for them to maintain an eldership as well. Elderships will have turnover naturally. As people get older, they will not serve as elders for one reason or another, which means that new men need to step up into that role. If that does not happen, the eldership does not continue. If the eldership does not continue, we no longer have a church functioning as God intended it to function. And so it's important. In Acts chapter 20, the text that was read for us, starting in verse 28, we get to see Paul address a little bit of this issue as he talks to the church at Ephesus, not the whole church, but to the elders from the church at Ephesus that he's taken the time to call to himself so that he can give them some parting words, a farewell address. Paul knows this is almost the end of his life. He knows that he will not see these men again. So he wants to give them some encouragement. But in that, we find a few reasons that we should have elders, that we need to have elders. In verse 28 here, if you read the text again, it says, "Therefore take heed to yourselves and to all the flock, among which the Holy Spirit has made you overseers to shepherd the church of God, which he purchased with his own blood." There are different ways that you can refer to elders. That's the one we use most often, is the term elder, but also shepherd would be appropriate, or overseer. All of those are used in a biblical way. There are some other terms that are not as easy to understand in English, but those terms are used. But in this verse, it uses the term overseer, but it also says shepherd and flock. The idea, the illustration is that the overseers of the church, the elders of the church, are shepherding the flock. It's an illustration from sheep, of course, but the idea is obvious enough that sheep need a shepherd. Now, I know that today when we use the term sheep or sheepish, we are usually using that in a negative way, to say that somebody is just a blind follower. But in reality, even if we don't want to see ourselves as sheep, God sees us as sheep. And sheep need shepherds. That's what Paul tells us here, that the flock is in need of having shepherds. Why? Well, because they need to be taken care of to a degree. They need the decision-making that comes along with this. They need protection. They need leadership. They need vision. They need guidance. All of those things have to happen, and without shepherds, those things are not going to take place, or they'll take place in a very inefficient way. But there's another part of this in the next couple verses, in verses 29 and 30. In verse 29, Acts chapter 20, it says, "For I know that after my departure, savage wolves will come in among you, not sparing the flock, and also from among yourselves, men will rise up speaking perverse things and draw away the disciples after themselves." Paul says the reason you need elders is because there is danger. If the church were established and nothing could ever happen to it, if the church were established and everything would be fine regardless of what happened, we wouldn't need elders. I guess you could say the same thing about a company as well. If nothing bad ever happened to a company, if nothing complicated ever happened in a business, you might not need any leadership. But there is danger, and so you need this leadership in place. These shepherds function as the first line of defense for the sheep. That's how it works with actual shepherding, and that's how it works in the church as well with this illustration. So a church that is without shepherds, or a church that has inactive shepherds, it would be the same thing just about. A church in that position is vulnerable to danger. What kind of danger? Well, the danger that Paul is talking about here is false teaching coming in among the brethren, or leaders rising up from within that have their own motives first instead of their motivation being Christ. So a church needs elders because God said that they need elders, of course, but also because it's God's plan to entrust his church to men to lead it, and also because we need shepherds, and shepherds help to defend the flock. Now, in other terms, in more practical ways, there are benefits to having elders. I want to address this for just a minute. One of the most practical reasons to have elders is because churches are made up of people. I don't know if you knew that, but a church is made up of people. This church is made up of about 60 people. How easy is it to get 60 people to agree on something? Seems pretty difficult. Now, what if your congregation is much larger? Whether it's 60 or 600, or in some cases 6,000 members, how easy is it to get them to agree to do anything? But if you're talking about a smaller group, then you might be able to accomplish that. If you're talking about a decision that needs to be made, it should be the case that the elders help expedite that process, that the decisions should be sped up because they can be handled by just a few. And that could be 2, that could be 8, that could be a dozen. It doesn't really matter. There's no biblical mandate for how many elders, at least not less than 2, but any number above that is okay. But that group is able to more effectively make decisions, and that's one of the most practical benefits of having elders. Another practical benefit here is that there is a central authority for the church. What does that mean? Well, it means that if there is something that needs to get done, then the elders are the ones that would be responsible for it. It also means, unfortunately, that if there are complaints that are raised, the elders would be the recipients of that. Now, in a congregation that does not have elders, most of the complaints would go to someone standing right here. And so I'm thankful that we have elders, because that's not the way that God intended it to work. Elders are the ones that have the responsibility and the privilege of serving in this way. So even more practically than this, though, in modern day terms, and it's wonderful that God's wisdom was able to foresee this or allow for this to take place. But in modern day terms, the church is viewed as a business from the outside. And as a business of sorts, it requires some kind of leadership to be able to sign off on things, like a mortgage for a building, or to sign off on any other utility service that you would need, or whatever the issue is. The elders are the ones that, from a business perspective, are in charge. I know that sounds very non-biblical, and it kind of isn't biblical, but practically speaking, God's wisdom allowed for that to happen. Now, on the exact opposite side of this, which seems kind of ironic, the eldership is a central authority, but it also helps to distribute the power that is held there. So it ensures that there is no one person in the congregation that has too much power, too much sway, too much influence on any part of the congregation. It doesn't put all of your eggs in one basket. We're going to talk a little bit more in just a second about the parable of the talents, but the idea with the parable of the talents, if you'll remember the story, is that a man goes away and he leaves money behind. And he wants that money to be managed. He wants that money to be taken care of. And so does he give that to one servant? No. But he gives it to 3 in that case. Why? Because he doesn't want to put all of his eggs in one basket. He wants to diversify. And that's what the eldership does as well. So that if one elder decided that they no longer believed some of the tenets of Scripture, then you would have another elder or elders that could combat that problem, so that there's not too much power in any one place. And alongside that, there is a system of checks and balances. We usually only use that phrase when talking about the United States government, except God designed it a system that works better than the United States government, believe it or not. So in the church, there is checks and balances within the eldership. The elders may be of different ages, and they usually are, and that's a good thing, because one may be older with a certain set of life experiences, one may be younger with a certain set of life experiences, and viewpoints may vary, and one may be more timid, and one may be more bold, and one may be a better teacher, but one may be more hospitable, and one may have different strengths, and the other have different weaknesses. And that's how it's supposed to be. In Proverbs chapter 11 and verse 14, it says, "Where there is no counsel, the people fall, but in the multitude of counselors there is safety." A better word for that there probably is advisor than counselor. But the idea is different viewpoints make things better to a degree. And that's certainly true within the eldership. That's why God designed it that way, so that there wouldn't be too much influence or too much power in any one place. And now, the third part of this lesson, the last part of this lesson, if you're counting, is talking about God and His desire for elders. God does desire that there would be men in each congregation that would step up to the role of elder. And traditionally speaking, and even over the last several years in this congregation and in every congregation, most congregations, there are men that step up to fulfill that role, and that's wonderful. But at the same time, there is a problem. There is a shortage of men that are qualified to be and willing to be elders in the Lord's church. Now, why is that? It seems like you could give a lot of different reasons as to why this is the case, why there are too few. And this is not a local problem, I'd like to point out. I've been to several congregations of the Lord's church, and I've never found one where they said, well, we just have too many men that are wanting to be elders that are just so qualified. It's always the opposite. It's, well, I wish we had one or two or three more elders, 2 or 3 more men that would step up into this role. But again, why is this the case? And the answer is an unfortunate answer, and it's a challenging answer, but the answer is this. It's not that we have a shortage of men that are qualified and willing to be elders. It's that we have a shortage of men that are willing to be strong and leading Christians. Now, I say that as a man that is failing in some respects in that role, and I say that as being part of that group. So I'm not trying to single anyone out there, but at the same time, there are a shortage of strong Christian men. There is a shortage of men who prepare themselves for that role. It does take preparation. It doesn't happen by accident. But there is an assumption. There's an assumption that if we just wait long enough, somebody will rise up into that role. We can't make that assumption. There's a lot of focus when talking about elders on 2 qualifications, just 2. The 2 qualifications that are the most visible. And we're going to talk about qualifications next week, I think. But most of the time we focus on 2 things. Number 1, is the person the husband of one wife? And number 2, do they have believing children? Now, there are about 19 other qualifications that are listed as to what an elder needs to look like. These 2 get the most focus because they're the most visible. It's harder to tell if somebody is hospitable or not just by looking at them. But at the same time, the other 19 are directly in your control. Sometimes children go astray despite your best efforts. Sometimes that happens, and sometimes you are not the husband of one wife, not through your own control. But the other 19 are well within our control. And those are an admirable goal for any male Christian and for any Christian. Read through the list of qualifications for elders and look at the whole list, not just the ones that stand out as being very visible. Again, like I said, there is an assumption that we have made for years, and I'm not saying just here, but I am saying here, that people will organically become ready to be elders by virtue of them being in the church. It takes intentionality for that to happen. It takes a willingness to grow into that role. We can't assume that somebody else is going to be the person that steps up into that role. So what does that mean for us? Well, we said with the parable of the talents that in the story, the master goes away and he leaves a certain amount of money in this case, but resources is the idea here. And when the master leaves these resources, he leaves one man a lot of resources. He leaves another man some and another man very little. And the choice is, what do you do with them? Well, I don't know what resources you've been given. I realize that this is targeted pretty much only at men at this point in the lesson. But whatever resources God has given you, you have the opportunity to double them. You have the opportunity to make yourself better and prepare yourself for this potential role. Now, that being said, maybe in examining yourself, you say that there are things that I lack in order to become an elder. There are things that I lack in order to become a qualified elder. And that very well may be the case. And of course, half of you in the room would say, yeah, that's me because I'm not a man. Well, let me say that I'm not qualified to be an elder either. I'm not qualified because I don't have any believing children, not to mention the years of life experience that I lack to do so. So what do we do if we're in that boat? Well, there's still plenty that we can do, and there's still the question of how can I serve God best. But if you're anywhere close to the role of being an elder, if God has given you the resources, the talents in your life to do so, and you say, well, somebody else will do it. And I say, well, maybe I'm lacking one or two things. Maybe I don't have all the qualifications down, so I just won't do it. Now, I don't know what it is that you might lack. Maybe you feel like you don't know enough, scripturally speaking, and maybe you don't. And maybe none of us know as much as we would like to, but that's something that we can improve upon. Or maybe it's the case that we have certain issues that need to be addressed. Maybe it's an issue of temperance. Maybe it's an issue of pride. Maybe it's an issue of greed or of quarreling with other people. Whatever the case may be, if you have a specific issue that needs work, well, take care of that too. It's not worth that standing between you and God's highest calling for you as a Christian on this earth. And maybe you are unqualified in other ways. And again, if that's you, depending on the situation, there may be things that you can do still to qualify yourself. Again, we'll talk about qualifications more next week. But if it's an issue of a personal character type, then we can work on that. If it's an issue of time, well, that's obviously a priority question. If you don't have time to be an elder, then why not? What is it that's in your life that's more important than that? But if you're not currently qualified to become an elder, why not? And what can you do about it? And maybe you say there's absolutely nothing I could ever do, but maybe there is. So this is not a lesson intended to say you need to become an elder today, but this is a lesson for all men in the congregation that could potentially be an elder at some point. And that means not just people that are middle-aged, not just people that are in their 30s, not just people that are of a certain age, but even young men that one day can and will be, if they prepare to be, the next generation of leadership for the church. But if we continue to assume that will happen without our talking about it, without our ever having to deal with the issue, then we are believing in a lie. So this morning, maybe you can't qualify yourself to be an elder, but maybe you can. Obviously, if you can, if there are things you need to help, or we need to help you with that we can help you to fix, then we'd love to do that. But this morning, if there's no way for you to be qualified, that's okay too. Because the question is still the same. How can I serve God? How can I serve God? There is no greater calling than to be an elder, and there's also no greater example to follow than those who are shepherds in the Lord's church. This morning, if you have a need that we can help you with, we want to assist you this morning. If all this does is help you to be a little bit more open-minded to the idea of one day being an elder, then this lesson did at least that much. But this morning, if there's anything we can help you with, we ask that you come forward now as we stand and as we sing.